Dear guests of the Riga Security Forum, we're lucky and happy to welcome you to another podcast session. And for the second time in this year's edition, we have gathered to talk about a topic that's very close to my heart. And that's certainly an important and upcoming topic in Eastern European and global political affairs, which is the role of gender and thus women and children in various conflict situations, but not only. Globally, we speak of the need to empower women, children, and minorities in conflict and post-conflict environments, as well as in peacetime. Not least through initiatives such as the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which was put in place first in 2001 by the United Nations. However, the reality on ground is often quite different. Instead of raising up to the challenge, it seems to me that sometimes the international norms and standards don't live up to the expectations. And whereas the situations are slowly and surely improving, sometimes we're not making it in the right time, at the right place to support women in international crisis situations. And for this reason, I have invited today a distinguished expert, Merissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program at the Wilson Center. Marissa, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. Marissa she has a lot of leadership experience in various projects at the Middle East that focused on economic development, the Syrian refugee crisis, education, youth, gender development, and I want to say that she has many positions that she's held during her career, and I will not name them all. However, it is true that we really have an excellent expert today to talk about the role of gender in the conflict situations in the Middle East. So, Marissa, I want to perhaps start with asking for your assessment. We see multiple conflicts ongoing at the same time in the region of Middle East. And I would like to ask, so what is your assessment of the gender effects of the conflicts and turbulence that women, children, and societies in general are experiencing in the region?
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this opportunity. This is a very important topic because when we're highlighting gender, and zooming into the impact of conflict, we are shedding light on how violence, conflicts, and wars impact half of our societies. In the Middle East, it's unfortunate that the Middle East continues to be a volatile region, that we have active conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, and then currently the Palestinian-Israeli arena with the ongoing war in Gaza. And so, of course, first and foremost, women and children are probably the first victims of these conflicts, and the elderly as well. But women and children are considered, to be vulnerable communities because of the various horrific tools and tactics that sometimes are used against them in situations of conflict and war. In Syria, the vast majority of Syrian refugees who were fleeing with their clothes on their back and sometimes holding their children's on their back as well, were women, because many of the men either had been killed or were part of the fighting. And so you see women's roles change in times of crisis, in times of conflict, to becoming heads of families in a refugee setting or a forced displacement setting that is extremely conducive to even more vulnerabilities and more violence against women. And it is imperative that women and children are protected in these settings. I mean, right now in Gaza, to be a woman in Gaza, to be a young woman in Gaza, is absolutely horrific. The figures that we are looking at, the data that's coming out about the availability of just hygiene and toilets, for example, it's something like one bathroom available per 700 people. And if half of these 700 people are women, and also half are under the age of 18, then we're really looking at such a horrible situation where women find themselves completely, vulnerable, completely oppressed in an environment that they cannot get out of because they don't control what happens. And I think that is the most unfortunate and tragic sort of component of being a woman in a conflict zone. One other thing that happens beyond, of course, women sort of taking charge of the family if they are the remaining household head or breadwinners, is also that things start shifting in society. If the conflict with for example, with in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, where these conflicts are still ongoing, what happens is that society somehow just stands back, and many of the phenomena that we see that have, are considered challenges are pronounced even further. So, for example, child marriage has been on the rise in conflict settings and in refugee settings as well, because women are seen, or young women are seen by their families as burdens, because there are economic pressures and financial pressures. And the international community tries its best through donor support, through development programs, to highlight these issues, but it's never enough. And I think one of the challenges that we see, not only in the humanitarian sector, because I think the humanitarian and development sector is actually led by women in many cases, but those two sectors, the humanitarian and development sector, are crucial to protecting women and children in these conflict scenarios. But they run against the security and political sector, which is primarily and overwhelmingly led by men. And sometimes many of the decisions taken in the security sector by military commanders or by politicians do not really understand or keep in mind the impact on the rest of society, because those decisions are very siloed. And that's why we need to have more women leaders, more women decision makers sitting at the table, talking security, talking political solutions. They have to be part of the peace and security dialogue that they are often sidelined from.
Marissa, from what you're saying and also from what I'm observing, it seems so obvious that women and children indeed are the most vulnerable parts of the conflict, let's say as an example to what's happening now in Gaza. However, it seems to me that we are simply not reaching all the goals that we've set forward as the international community, as the European Union, for instance, who also is very, very supportive of gender equality, as the transatlantic community, for that matter, who are putting forward these ideals of democracy. However, gender and the vulnerability of women, it seems to me, is quite absent from the overall discussion at the moment. So why do you think we always come to the same obstacle? We simply don't speak of this enough.
I think one of the challenges here is what I mentioned earlier about women in decision-making positions. It's critical that not only we have gender representation at the decision-making tables, but it's also critical to ensure that women who are at the table are advocating for gender issues. Even if they are representing the security sector or the military sector, they are there to represent and to ensure that this discussion is taking place. I think the second component here, Elizabeth, is also that a lot of these multilateral agreements and multilateral agendas and multilateral institutions are under a lot of pressure, precisely because the ideals and values that they've put forward are exactly where most people want the international community to be headed towards. But as you mentioned, we're not really seeing this trickle down on the ground. We're not seeing the progress that we hope for. And this disconnect very much highlights the pressures that the multilateral institutions are under. They're being challenged by a lot of these wars, the way that these wars are being waged, again, the intensity and the violence that is unprecedented in the way that we see it. And there's an aspect of it on the ground. There's an aspect of it that we see online, with the disinformation and information wars as well. And guess what? Women are also victims online. They are targeted for speaking up. They are targeted, their character assassinated or culturally canceled for speaking up and for challenging some of the norms that we see. So that's part of the challenge. It's those two components are important to keep in mind, because we are not discussing these issues in a vacuum. There's so much else happening. And so the more representation we see for women leaders who have the power, the authority, the decision-making authority to be able to have these conversations, the more likely we will see shifts in some of these decisions and how they impact young girls, women, and children.
Indeed, it seems to me that even though I don't think we speak of this enough, it comes now to my mind that fairly recently in Iran, we saw enormous protests as a result of the death of Mahsa Amini, which of course became a symbol for the women of Iran, not only for their own liberation, but also for broader political change. And Iran inevitably is a key actor in the grand geopolitical game of the Middle East. Do you think that perhaps the situation in Iran after the death of Mahsa Amini changed something in the region? Did it have a lasting impact on the role of women either in Iran or more broadly? And did it perhaps bring to the attention of decision makers that we must at some point consider women's needs more carefully?
Well, I think when it comes to the Iranian context, that it definitely left an imprint on political protests, on speaking up, on challenging authority and challenging a regime that is not used to being challenged the way that that it was, with these protests that happened in over 50 cities all around Iran. And it was, as you mentioned, very much led by not only women, but young women. I think that's critical, and this was, of course, inspiring many other women in the region. Many women spoke up and protested also, in smaller numbers, but that definitely took place. I worry that for many of the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, that was actually a warning that instead of thinking, oh, we need more women at the decision-making table, that we're probably going to see more oppressive measures. And that's exactly the backlash that we see in Iran today, because that was where the ayatollahs and the mullahs in Iran decided to go. They responded with brutality. They responded with mass imprisonments of any dissent. And a lot of these people were women. And so the pendulum unfortunately swung in the opposite direction, but that only showcases how fragile some of these authoritarian institutions are. If they are threatened by young women calling for equal rights, then we're talking about fragile institutions. Or fragile systems. I mean, how long can this last? We're not going to see change happening overnight, but I can tell you from the conversations that I've had across the Middle East and North Africa region, and I will include, Afghanistan in that as well. Women are very well educated. In certain countries, women are outperforming men in universities. and they are speaking up. They are more organized. They are able to mobilize better. And I have hope that we will see multiple iterations of change and progress. And there will be lots of setbacks because you have forces who do not want to see this change, because for them, equality, the way that you and I and others in the international community see it, is a loss of power for the male decision makers, particularly in such authoritarian settings. But I'm a firm believer that the hope lies, especially when it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, in women leaders emerging. And when I say women leaders, I'm not just talking about women leaders being appointed to positions in government. I'm talking about women exercising leadership from the bottom up, civil society, academia, various sectors. And I think that we're going to see more of that change taking place, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Indeed. So I wonder, in the Middle East overall, we really are speaking about authoritarian systems that, don't rely necessarily on democratic systems of legitimacy. And at the same time, this also gives them power to, in certain situations, breach the principles of human rights, which of course also include those of gender equality. So do you think that gender equality, in a more, sort of perhaps as a analytical assessment you can pass, is reconcilable in any way with the authoritarian systems? Or are we speaking about a much broader change that needs to happen in order to eventually see the rights of women being observed?
I think we have to look at structural changes, absolutely. But the efforts have to come from both directions. I mentioned how so many women are, walking the walk and talk, or walking the talk from the bottom up at the civil society level, the social sector in particular. But I think women who are also in positions of authority, whether they're appointed or they are elected to the various, legislative bodies, or women in the judiciary, and they do exist, of course, across the region, they also have to advocate so that this pressure is, this change is coming from two different directions. But we do need structural changes. We do need to communicate with the other half of society. We need to bring men into this conversation and start with young boys and men to have these conversations. Because what's happening is, all this talk about feminism, women's rights, is alienating a lot of the young boys and men. It's creating this, negative reaction, particularly among the very sort of traditional conservative, segments of society. And so we need to also tackle the other side of it. And I think that's one recommendation that I do have for many of the programs, development programs that are targeting or focused on women's issues or, empowering women. Men have to be part of that conversation. Dialogue is very important, because at the end of the day, if we're going to change these gender stereotypes that very much are, systemic, and not only in the Middle East, these systemic sort of stereotypes exist all over the world, but they're more pronounced in the Middle East because there are some legal issues as well. But if we join together and have these, larger conversations, then we can talk about how it impacts families, societies, countries in a much more different way. And I think that there are a few countries in Europe that have managed, I think, to tilt that balance towards more equal representation. And you see that the impact on society is also very different. When in the Middle East, governments tick a box for expanding paternity leave from 1 day to 4 days, it's just really, they're checking a box. But what is 4 days of paternity leave going to do to change how these gender roles are established. It's not going to redefine gender roles. But if we start talking about longer paternity leaves, for example, and I'm just using that as a very minor example because it impacts families all over the world, then we're going to see a very different outcome, very different impact. I think the other aspect to why we need to include men in the conversation is that there's a challenge for the whole concept of what it means to be a man. Like the masculinity sort of framework is also adding a lot of pressure on men in society, particularly in the Middle East, where unemployment is very, very high amongst youth. It's close to 30 to 40%. In countries like Jordan, youth unemployment is close to 50%. And so this adds a lot of pressure on young men. They're supposed to be the providers, the main breadwinners. And so that adds more pressures. And of course, that's always reflected in gender relations. And so this really does start with a conversation with the entire society. And the education system has to be reformed to be able to create an environment to talk about these issues safely.
Indeed. And now when we speak about, this, I would say, in a sense, the conflict between Israel and Gaza now, to me, is somehow casting shadow on what it means to sort of be a democratic country, although we can argue that in Israel there are some certain issues with democracy, what it means to be a society which is more or less inclusive, because of course the Israeli IDF pride itself for including women in the power structures. In general, the Israeli society pride themselves with, reaching certain standards of gender equality and even inclusion of LGBT. So overall, they seem to be putting themselves, very much ahead when it comes to reaching certain gender equality goals compared to the rest of the region. But now the conflict in general, I think, at least to my understanding, seems to have affected negatively the perception of Israel and overall the standards and norms that Israel is upkeeping. What is your take on this? Will it have some effect on the way gender equality is perceived in the region?
Yes, I think it's it is extremely challenging, precisely because of how this conflict has impacted women and children. But that goes with both sides, because we have seen innocent women and children in Israel being targeted, killed on October 7th by Hamas and other factions that were part of the attacks on Israel. And so that's a component that we have to highlight. The gender component also is, emerging with is clear with the hostages that were also taken, the innocent civilians, a lot of them women and children. Some of them, one of the children is almost 4 years old. So we see that now with the hostage negotiated deal that was just announced, a few hours ago, we see that the vast majority are going to be women and children. And that is a reminder of how vulnerable women and children are. So that's a very important aspect. So that's one aspect of it. And then you have how, Israel's response in Gaza, the daily bombardment has affected children, has killed, over 4,000 children. So more than 50 or 60% of those who were killed are children. And then you also have a generation that basically will be traumatized for a very long time, precisely because some of them may have lost their moms, their dads, or both parents. And so the impact on both societies is absolutely tragic. There's a lot of grief, there's a lot of anger, And yes, this no matter how progressive your data is when it comes to gender equality in terms of how many positions you have in a government or in a council or in the military, conflict and war absolutely sheds light on the worst aspects of how it impacts women and children in particular. And so, yes, it's very difficult to see this data differently when you're in the middle of war, and you see how this is impacting innocent people.
And here, perhaps coming back to the Women, Peace and Security Initiative, now there are so many levels to gender equality, and of course we have to start, from indeed making sure that there is a paternity leave of some sort available to men in societies. We have to make sure that men are part of the discussion on a national and international level. And unfortunately, I think in every single, even European countries, we very often see that this is not the case. It's only women that are taking charge of issues that pertain to gender or children's rights. But the Women, Peace and Security Initiative is one of the primary instruments that keep countries accountable, because it has a national action plan that certain countries have taken up as a standard for them. And here we can speak about Yemen, United Arab Emirates, Palestine, Lebanon, and some other countries in the Middle East and MENA region. Do you see that taking up a national action plan is actually conducive to change in the region? Have we seen some progress? If yes, then what are the elements that actually make change happen?
I think it's very important to have action plans, and I applaud the work of the governments that have put forward action plans. But action plans are not enough, because if they are just sitting on the shelf and there's no, monitoring and evaluation mechanism or accountability to ensure that these steps are being taken, then, having them is once again just checking a box. So it's important for various actors within civil society, that they also hold governments accountable if these action plans are not being implemented as planned. So of course it's again a positive thing that we have these action plans, but they are not really of use if they're not being implemented. And that's where we have to ensure that gender mainstreaming tools are part of these action plans. And this way, a lot of the different aspects of these action plans can be incorporated into government policies and government processes. But of course, this work takes a long, long time. One of the projects that I worked on in Jordan was focused on fiscal reform. And when we, introduced the gender dimension, beyond just ensuring that we have 50% representations in the capacity building programs, we needed to introduce the concept of gender responsive budgeting to the Ministry of Finance. And it took a lot of work, just communicating and talking and changing mindsets about how you actually change your spreadsheets to reflect gender, to just highlight not only gender in terms of, well, how many salaries are going to women and how many salaries are going to men, but what are the different budgets set by different ministries, from health to finance to culture to foreign affairs, that have different aspects of it, that that also gender aspects of it, that highlight how this will impact women or contribute to gender development. And it's very, very challenging. I think Egypt and Morocco are two of the countries in the region who have made significant progress in gender responsive budgeting. But again, there has to be consistent efforts in this direction. The governments can adopt a lot of these action plans, but we need a lot more work, probably from civil society and other interest groups, to ensure that governments are being held accountable if they do not move forward with these action plans.
And now, perhaps already concluding, Marissa, so what would be your top three priorities for not only the international community, but also the decision makers in the region? And if you want, you can separate those in order to make sure that in the future, and actually perhaps starting from now, we actually take into account the needs of women and children in conflict situations. And I'm asking this because I really hope that at some point, when we as international relations scholars look at issues that worry us um, on the international scene, we will be able to automatically say, listen, so there are some things that we need to take care of first, and women and children and their needs definitely need to be factored in this equation.
I think the first recommendation, and I mentioned this earlier, is the importance of having women at the decision-making table. Women have to be part of, emergency cabinets or emergency committees, or just simply governmental cabinets. We need to ensure that more women are also being elected to legislative bodies, not only as token women, but women who have an agenda for gender development, who want to push for women's issues in parliaments and in legislative bodies, whether they're on the national level or subnational level. The second recommendation is also what I mentioned earlier. It's to ensure that we're including men in the conversation, that we're not alienating half of society on behalf of a cause that impacts the other half. And I think that I'm seeing a lot more of these approaches taking shape, but it really does start at the very bottom of the pyramids. You need to start with young girls and boys. You need to reform education curricula to make sure that the images, for example, the pictures and school books reflect the values that we're talking about when we're talking about gender equality and human rights. So that is, I think, very critical. And third, when it comes to conflict settings in particular, I think we need to ensure that in every discussion we have representatives of the humanitarian and development sectors at the table to ensure that the decisions that are being made are factoring, at a minimum, factoring in the perspective of the sector that absolutely not only assesses the impact on women and children, but of course also pushes that agenda forward to ensure protection for all.
Thank you very much, Marissa. It was indeed a pleasure to have you, and we hope to discuss perhaps the same or other topics in future Riga security forums. Thank you very much, dear audience. It was a pleasure to talk to you about issues that, once again, are very, very close to our hearts and to our minds. And we will see you in the next podcast.